All right, well, welcome back to Mike's Gun World. We're going to do part 3, the reassembly of the Smith & Wesson 38 double action revolver from the 1884, whatever the heck it is. If you've been following along, you know what I'm talking about. We also had a problem with the rear sear. And it's taken me a number of days to get it sort of squared away. I have some recording of it, but it's not really worth it. It's kind of boring. At the end of the day, the old, or the new hammer that I picked up in the lot of parts had a pin in here that I needed to get out, and I needed to get it out so I could put it into the original hammer right here. So this pin holds the stirrup, which holds the mainspring in place. And I was pretty sure that the rear sear and hammer, the catch on the hammer was the problem and the reason why it wasn't going into single action mode. I confirmed that with how worn out the catch is on the newer hammer. And how loose the fit was with the rear sear compared to the original sear and the original hammer. So it took a lot to get that pin out. I had to soak it one full night in a rust remover, and then I had to soak it another full night in some penetrating oil liquid wrench, and even then it was really, really difficult to get out. But I did manage to get it out, and I managed to actually get it back into right there. I managed to actually get it back into the original hammer. So that's the pin from the hammer that I found. It's holding the stirrup in place and the mainspring. And I did say I wanted to do some testing, and hopefully we didn't have to go any further. This gun would just simply go into single action mode. So as you can see, I don't have the pin all the way in for the rear sear. It is holding it in place. I do have the rear sear spring in place, and right now she absolutely goes into single action mode. So now that we know she'll go into single action mode, it's time to actually take these couple of pieces back out, and we're going to go through the reassembly of the Smith & Wesson and finish up the series part 3, put this gun back into serviceable order, and we are going to take it to the range and film, run a couple of rounds through it. Happy this worked. Happy to get back at this. Let's get to work. Okay, so step 1, we are going to have to get the trigger sear and the pawl back up into the frame. And the way this all fits together is that the trigger sear sits in this slot right here. And you can see it kind of there. It fits real nicely in there. There's a little groove, and then the pawl has got it's got a little pin on it, and it fits right into the hole here in the rear of the trigger and trigger sear. And make sure you have it lined up correctly, and that all fits together, and that is how the assembly works. The problem is it's too thick to actually go through the bottom of the frame, so you have to do this inside the frame. And like I said earlier in part 2, this is a really small frame, small firearm, and it does take a little bit of finesse to get this done. So what we want to do, and I think I'm going to just lower the camera a little bit more so you can see what's happening. This is where the trigger pin is going to hold the trigger in place right here. We'll slide the trigger up into the frame, and then we need to work the trigger sear into its slot. And again, there's a groove right here where it all kind of fits together correctly, and the holes will then line up and be ready to accept the stud from the pawl and the pawl spring. So again, it takes some finesse there. I saw it all click into place. You might not have been able to see that on camera, but it did. The pawl sits in this condition. This is obviously the piece that rotates your cylinder. This is the spring. We're going to drop that stud into the hole. Again, you can see I have kind of large hands. It's not real easy to get in here and work on these parts, but we're going to try to slip this in. I think we got it. It sounded like it went into place. It did. And then we got to just make sure it seats all the way down, and we pull the sear, trigger sear forward. They're catching because we've got to get this pawl spring. Yeah, we actually have the pawl spring on the wrong side, so yeah, we get to take it apart again. Okay, so I do have a magnifying glass here. I do highly recommend this if you're working on super small parts, and I had to use it to actually get everything seated correctly in here. All I can say is it takes a little bit of finesse. You've got to get this pawl and pawl spring correctly lined up with the trigger sear in the front here the way it is. Now all three of these pieces are connected, and the pawl is in the correct spot. It is toward there's a slot here right toward the front of the gun. You can see the pawl, the point of the pawl sticking out. So we have these pieces in place. Now we don't want to pin them yet because we have to get the cylinder stop over the top of the trigger and through the back of the trigger right here. Remember, it connects or actually makes contact with the rear sear spring. So the next thing we want to do is get our cylinder stop over the top of the trigger. There's a slot in here. Get it to drop down just like that. So when the trigger pin goes in, we can actually pin, well, at this point we could probably pin the barrel stop, the cylinder stop, and I gotta stop doing that. I keep calling it the barrel stop. It's the cylinder stop. We wanna get the cylinder stop locked in place. So that's going to be our next venture, and then we're going to get the trigger pin in place. Okay, so before I actually put the cylinder stop pin in place, you can see there's a little slot here in the cylinder stop itself, and the pin's going to go through, and it's going to go through that slot, and it's going to hold that in place. Now, this pin is smaller than the trigger in the rear sear. It's slightly smaller, and this one goes in fairly easily. Okay, so I've got it started. You can see it's close to going through the slot. Just take your punch and gently move that cylinder stop to get the pin into the slot. Of course, normally it goes right in. It's starting to. It might take a tap or two, very lightly. slowly moving. Like I said, a lot of this just takes finesse. I can see the cylinder stop itself starting to slide around a little bit in there. But you can see that the top of the cylinder stop is right there, so it's correctly seated in place. It just shifted a little bit, and I got to make sure the pin is actually coming through. So I do need my trusty spyglass, and I can see it. It's there, but you really want to be gentle with this. You can also see that it has shifted slightly on me, so we may want to take this out. I'm not sure yet. I'm going to give it another tap or two and see if we can get it through the other side of the lower front frame. It's not coming out, so I'm going to have to pull it back out, and then I'm going to try to put it in from the left side of the frame. Okay, I've got the pin loose and out. So let's try going from the left side. We might have a little better luck. It doesn't seem to be quite lining. There we go. Now it lined up perfectly. It should slide right through. A little bit more movement out of it. Again, we're going to tap it lightly and see if we can get it through the frame. It's close. It's very close to going through. I'm not real comfortable with the fact that the cylinder stop is actually sliding kind of left to right in the frame. Sure what's causing that. Could just be misalignment of the pin. So we're going to take the pin back out. Use our smithing block. Take the pin back out. Here, it's out. Should be right there, and it is. I'm going to go at this from a slightly different direction. I am going to get the trigger itself, the trigger pin itself, in place. We'll hold the cylinder stop in place with a 1/16 punch. Then we want to get the holes lined up for the trigger. See if we can get the pin through here. That might help us a little bit in terms of getting that front cylinder stop spring. There we go. Now that just slid right through. I'm not going to punch it all the way through yet. Things look better with the cylinder stop at this point. So let's get that pin back in there. There we go. Now it's slid in. That's exactly how it should slide in. Very easy, just like that. So it really is a little bit of trial and error. What makes most sense? Don't put too much pressure on any of these parts. They're old. And again, remember, I have had the unique opportunity of breaking this and having to look for a new one. So take your time as you're doing it. At this point, we do have two pins in. They're not all the way in, but we do have the trigger pawl, the front trigger sear, and the cylinder stop all in place. So the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get the rear sear and pin in place. Now this is fairly easy. Goes in this direction. So this is a sear itself that catches on the back of the hammer. We're going to drop this in there, and with the size of my hands, I usually just use a punch to finesse it into place. You can see it coming out the bottom of the frame, and that's because there's a slot in the trigger where this is going to slide, and that's where it makes contact with the cylinder stop. Takes a little bit to line it up. It's moving into place. We're very close at this point. There we go. Those holes are lined up almost perfectly. I'm going to want to get the pin in here and make sure that it is correctly seated. The pin should go right in. It does. Let's make sure everything is moving correctly in here. The cylinder stop is in its correct location right there. We're not getting movement. We're not getting movement out of the rear sear, which tells me it's probably incorrectly hooked underneath. So if you remember, the cylinder stop has got a hook here and the rear sear is here. The rear sear has to be on top, not underneath. So the only thing you can do at this point really is just knock the pin back out of the rear sear. You can see that came right out. I do like to keep these in the metal trays. They're so small. I don't want them bouncing around and getting lost. So we're going to push this sear back just a little bit. We're going to change its angle. Try to make sure that it's sitting on top of the cylinder stop. There we go, it's through. Use my thumb to kind of hold it in place. I think we got it this time. It's definitely in place. Let's get the pin, push the pin through. Yep, that's slotted correctly. And now you can see, I think you can see, that the rear sear is actually moving correctly. That tells me it's now correctly above the cylinder stop. So at this point, we're really in good shape. We're ready to put the hammer back on the hammer stud. So we're going to want to, as we're slipping this in place, you can see the front sear right there. The cylinder or the hammer drops right into there, and now the trigger sear is connecting with the hammer properly. The hammer is moving correctly forward. The trigger is moving forward. This is telling me that all of the parts and pieces in here are correctly in place. Okay? So it's critical that you get the firearm into this position. There is a rear sear spring, and that's the next thing that we want to put in. Now, the hammer has to be in place when you put the rear sear spring in. Otherwise, there's a good chance that that spring will pop the rear sear and push down on the cylinder stop and either bend it or break it. So this is the critical part right here, that these components are put together. I got a dog going crazy in the background, so I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, we got Perry quieted down, so we can move forward now. So here's the rear sear spring, and it's going to slide underneath the rear sear. It's going to put pressure up on the rear sear. The best way I found to do this is kind of get my fingers in between where the handle should be and just slide it into place underneath the rear sear. And I just saw it drop under, and it fits right here. Now, this is probably the most challenging part of getting this back together. I am not going to film everything I do because this could take me up to a half hour to do. It's taken me quite a while to get this spring. It's not easy to hold the spring down, but typically I'll take a 1/16 punch. I'll get the spring held down, and I'll try to work the punch into the hole of the rear sear spring. Well, I actually just did it. That's surprising. I've never done it that quick. Maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to get this pin through. I have struggled massively with this in the past, but if you can follow the punch through, keep pressure on the rear sear spring. Let's see if we can just tap it right through. Ooh, boy, you got to be careful. These are really, really, really tiny pins, and I would hate to even think about breaking or losing one of these. Oh my God, that's the fastest I've ever gotten it in. It's right in there. So we do now have everything but the mainspring back in place. We're moving along a lot faster than I thought we would. Okay, so we've got the mainspring, and it's got the little groove here in the hook, and this sits in the saddle of the hammer. So we're going to slide that up and get it seated properly. At this point, we really just have to just gently bend the mainspring and get it to slide into place. And we've got the mainspring seated. The next thing we have to do is get the mainspring screw in place, which goes right here into the frame. Screw it in, and it's going to put pressure onto the mainspring. And you can see it as it's starting to bend the mainspring, which wants to pop out. You just want to keep it in place, keep turning the screw until you get it all the way in. And there you go. It's in place. We got to loosen it, tighten it again. Nope, not quite in place. Take a turn out, get the mainspring seated, and then put your last couple turns in. At this point, we really have all of the action put back together. Everything should be working correctly. We're going to pull the hammer back. You can see we're very easily now going into and locking in single action mode, so we've got that problem corrected. If you pull the trigger, it's going to fire. So we have it back together. We're down to really just the trigger spring and getting the trigger guard back in place, and then obviously the plate and some of the smaller pieces, and our gun's back together. So this does take a little finesse. I do have a couple pins that are still out just a touch. Rear sear pin, so we're going to knock that back into place. The trigger pin sticking out a little bit over here, we're going to knock that back into place. Our pins are all in place. Everything looks fantastic. It's working correctly. It's working as it should. So this also takes a little finesse. So right on top of the trigger here, there's 2 tangs. And the trigger spring sits right on top of those tangs. And how I figured out is there's marks from 2 tangs right there in the trigger spring. So pull the trigger back a little bit and seat it. Just like that. That's all it takes. It's just going to sit just like that. Then we're going to take our trigger guard, and remember, it's got a hook in the front and a hook in the back. And we're going to get it over the trigger in the back. And everything takes just a little bit of finesse and time. But we will get this into place. And now we push back on the trigger spring, which I hope it didn't pop out, and pull the trigger guard forward. Okay, we didn't hook it quite the way we wanted to. The trigger spring did pop, so this will take a couple tries. Get that out. Get it seated back on the tang correctly. Tangs, multiple. Let's get the trigger guard around the trigger. Here we go. We're going to push it back. And then it should drop right in the slot in the front, which it did. And hopefully I got just enough power to get the rear in place. And if I don't, we're going to have to go back to the vice grips, so I don't quite have the power. Let me get some tape on here, and well, unbelievably off camera, I managed to, as I was putting the tape on, actually get this seated correctly, and it pops right into place. So I did not have to use the vice grips, thank God. I don't like using something that kind of blunt on something like this. So, well, I can tell you right now, we're going to have to take it apart again because the trigger spring slipped out of place. That's just part of the finesse of this. It takes some time. It takes some trial and error. Okay, it took a number of tries, but you get the general idea of how that spring has to sit on the 2 tangs of the trigger. I did get it all in place. I did manage to get it into place with just my bare hands. So we didn't have to take the brute force method, which I'm glad. And it is working absolutely perfectly. Double action, single action. I mean, this gun is just right now running great. So the last couple of things we have to do is we got to put the brake latch back in place. And I do have a different one. I do have one that's blued. I don't have it out, so I'm going to have to dig through my parts box and get it out. And then we're going to put that in place. Okay, so here's the rear latch. This is the original from my grandfather's gun, and then this came from the parts lot. It's a lot cleaner. The finish is a lot cleaner. The bluings looks a little bit better. I think overall it's going to look nicer in this gun. So we're going to switch it out. We're going to switch out the latches and put this other latch in. So remember, there's a spring and plunger in here, and the point goes toward the bottom of the firearm, and there's a little slot really down in there. It's hard to see where this fits, and it typically, if you line it up, should just drop right into place, and it did. And we'll take a punch and just there get it seated. So part of rear latch is it also holds your rear sights right here, or your rear sights. So it's obvious which way that goes. Your sights go to the top. We're going to get it in here and hooked, and then we got to get some pressure on the spring to get the holes lined up. And then we take basically what I'm calling a pin screw and slide it through there. Not quite wanting to go through. Let's see if we can turn it a little bit. It's holding it in place. Sometimes a tap will do it, sometimes it won't. There we go. Tapped it into place, then it's, there we go. Then it screws into place. And now we've got our top brake. We got our top brake latch in place. I think it does look, that bluing looks a lot nicer against the nickel. Make sure it closes correctly. If it doesn't, we have to go back to the old one. Because again, it's a different model. I think it's a mod 4. It might be a mod 2. It's definitely not a mod 3. And I'll be honest with you, the latch almost seems like it's a little bit shorter. It doesn't want to close. So as much as I like that blued latch, we're probably going to have to go back to the original model Smith & Wesson 38 Model 3 latch. So let's get this out and see if that is in fact what our problem is. I kind of find it hard to believe that one of the modifications was the latches. In reading about the gun, it was more about the sears and the side plate than it was really the latch. But yeah, I guess it's possible they made a modification to the latch. If we line them up side by side, I don't know. Could be. Honestly, it could be about 1,000th, 2,000ths of an inch off, something like that. Maybe a little bit more, but that's about all it took for it to not close correctly. And it's quite possibly why the pin and screw went in as easy as it did, because it really typically doesn't go in that easy. So we are going to go back to the old latch. Yep, there we go. We got the hole lined up. Get the pin in place. You know, sometimes it's easier to stick a punch in there to hold it, but a lot of times you can just work it in. Tap or two there, it's moving, it's in place. And then we'll screw that back into place. The latch pin, and then if we close it, no, look at that, we're still having some trouble. I think I have a feeling I know what the problem is too. Let me get this apart and we'll talk about what that problem might be. Okay, so my suspicions were correct. This point does go to the bottom, but the problem is you cannot slide the catch directly in. when you're putting it in back into the top of the frame, you actually have to put it in on an angle and get that spring pushed back a little bit. So my theory of the other latch being slightly smaller, although it does look a little bit smaller, it's not. And it locks perfectly and it breaks perfectly. So we're really seriously down to almost nothing at this point. We can open it up. The barrel drops in place, and you gotta lift the latch so it can spin. It's spinning correctly. The cylinder stop is correctly in place right there. Let's close it. Cylinder stop is working correctly. It holds in single action. Cylinder stop is holding correctly. Everything is working as it should. At this point, we're down to really nothing. The side plate goes back onto the hammer stud. And if you remember correctly, it is a very tight fit, but that one just popped right into place. That's perfect. There's the hammer stud nut, and we're going to screw that back into place. That should lock down the side plate, which it is locking it down very nicely. We've got single action, we've got double action, we've got the nice blued latch for the top brake, we've got the nice blued handle. I still have some polishing to do on the cylinder to really complete this as I put it into the collection, but I'm not going to do any of that until we get it out to the range and we put a couple rounds down range. Make sure she's firing correctly. I mean, everything is working perfect at this point. The boring part of the job, get the handles back in place. And I'm going to need just a smaller bit for that. The escutcheon on the right side spins a little bit, so you got to lock it down. Try to lock it down with your finger. Get that tightened up. She's a beautiful looking gun. Let's get a microfiber over it, clean it up just a little bit from the fingerprints. We'll get some flits on here and my Dremel and clean it up, clean up the cylinder. But there she is. There is your 1894 Smith & Wesson 38 double action top brake. Hope you had fun watching these videos. Please hit like and subscribe if you like them. Leave me some comments about this. If you have any questions about the age of the gun or trying to identify a serial number, how to disassemble, how to reassemble, or you're looking for parts, I do have some extra parts. Don't hesitate. Now, we're not 100% done yet because I do want to go to the range. It's unfortunate I can't walk out my back door and fire it. I can't do that. We'll have to go to the firing range and take some film before we actually wrap up this episode. But that is how you disassemble and reassemble. Double action, single action working perfectly. see you at the range.
All right. Mike's Gun World. Here we are at our favorite range on target. We've got the Smith with us. We're about to test fire our first few rounds. Let's see how it goes. I don't want the gun blowing up, but I'm going to test it at some point.
Looks like we're going to have to get a better camera for when we go to the range, and try to ask for a lane when somebody else isn't shooting in there. It's kind of hard when it's open to the public. But as you can see, it fired perfectly for me. Diane, my wife, she got a few shots in herself, so let's watch her go. So there she is. That's our 3-part series. Smith & Wesson 38 top break. She ran perfect. Absolutely no issues. Now it's time to get her cleaned up. I'm going to do a little bit more polishing on it, and she goes back in the collection. Thanks for tuning in. Again, if you like the channel, like what you saw, please hit subscribe. Please hit like. And if you have any questions at all about this firearm or any others, I'd be happy to answer. Leave them in the comments down below. See you soon.